The Obama administration has backed a UN arms treaty that regulates the international trade of weapons. The next step is ratification in the U.S. Senate. But opponents say the treaty could burden law-abiding gun owners and businesses here in America. Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott says if ratified, Texas will lead the charge to have it overturned. He joins us now from Austin. General Abbott, why are you against this treaty?
Well, John, let me point out two great concerns that we have. First, the treaty is laden with both loopholes and loose language that you can literally drive a tank through that threaten Second Amendment rights of all Americans. But secondly, and maybe the bigger picture, is it's quite disconcerting that we see the United States of America entering into an agreement with the United Nations that empower the United Nations to limit rights that we are guaranteed under the Bill of Rights. The United Nations cannot be trusted with the United States Bill of Rights. Treaties do not trump the Constitution, and so we are prepared to wage a legal battle to ensure that our Bill of Rights, Second Amendment rights, are going to be guaranteed and protected.
Okay, so let me get you to answer a question that many people have, and that is, how would this treaty trample on the Second Amendment rights of Americans? Because this is an international treaty dealing in the international trade of arms, and specifically says in the resolution, quote, it reaffirms the sovereign right of any state, meaning country, to regulate and control conventional arms exclusively within its territory pursuant to its own legal or constitutional system. Language may be loose, but that's pretty specific, General.
Well, there's some other specific in there also, John, that does some other things. One, it sets up a, quote, secretariat in the United Nations that's going to be in charge of overseeing the implementation of this agreement. Two, it requires the regulation by the member states, one of which is the United States, to regulate the transfer, transportation of firearms. Three, it sets up a registry so that the United States, if it's going to comply with this UN treaty, is going to have a registry of those who fall under the categories that are regulated by this treaty. That would be an additional encumbrance of our Second Amendment rights. This is a pathway, John, to the United States allowing the United Nations and foreign bureaucrats to find out what's going on here, because, see, another thing that's contained in this treaty is that all the information that the United States gathers based upon what happens in our own territory must be given to the United Nations for the United Nations to share with all the member states across the entire globe.
Now, the registry that you're referring to uses the language, quote, end user, when it talks about international transfers of arms. It's been suggested that if the Beretta Gun Company in Italy were to ship weapons to the United States, the end user that would be on that registration would be the individual. Do you believe it would go that deep down, or would it just be the importer as the end user?
Well, see, you're bringing up precisely the point that I made, and that is the loose language and loopholes. End user isn't defined in there. End user could be defined as the very individual here in the United States who's going to be purchasing that weapon, and that person would be subject to a registry that the UN would control, that the UN would share around the world. We believe that violates your Second Amendment rights.
Now, the big concern in the Senate, as I read it from a lot of Republican members of the Senate, isn't so much to this idea of whether or not there would be a gun registry. And there also doesn't seem to be the appetite in the Senate for the two-thirds majority needed to ratify this treaty. Their concern is, why should the U.S. sign this arms treaty when Iran, Syria, and North Korea, who haven't signed on to it, will simply ignore it?
Right. Well, for one, they will ignore it. But secondly, if you look at why Syria decided not to sign on to it, and that's because this UN treaty does not limit guns being provided to terrorists. And that's one of the more offensive thing about it. Here the United States has entered into an agreement that limits Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans, but doesn't limit the right or ability of terrorists to gain access to these firearms.
All right. Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott, it's always good to see you. Thanks so much for taking time this Sunday afternoon with us. Really appreciate it.
You too, John. Thank you.